Your body created something physical yesterday that didn't exist the day before. Not metaphorically, literally. A molecule that wasn't present in your tissues, a protein configuration that had never formed in your cells, a neural connection that represents new circuitry in your brain. And the blueprint for that creation didn't come from your genes or your diet or random cellular processes. It came from an emotion you felt. What I'm about to describe isn't consciousness theory or spiritual philosophy. This is documented molecular biology operating according to principles that most people never learn because the implications are too destabilizing to consensus reality. There's a specific mechanism by which your emotional states directly translate into physical matter in your body. Not through some mysterious energetic process, through measurable biochemical cascades that follow predictable patterns. The law is simple. Sustained emotional states generate specific molecular signatures that your cells read as instructions for which genes to express, which proteins to manufacture, which structures to build or dismantle. Your emotions aren't reactions to your physical state. They're the architects of it. But here's what makes this mechanism invisible to most people. The translation from emotion to matter happens below conscious awareness, on timescales that make the causation impossible to perceive without specific knowledge of what to look for. You feel an emotion, and 6 hours later, a gene expresses. 12 hours later, a protein assembles. 3 days later, a receptor configuration changes. 2 weeks later, you notice a shift in how your body responds to situations. The gap between emotional cause and physical effect is wide enough that you never connect them. You experience the physical changes as random fluctuations in your health, energy, resilience, or vulnerability. You don't recognize them as the material manifestation of emotional patterns you've been running for days or weeks. Researchers studying psychoneuroimmunology have mapped the exact pathways. When you sustain an emotional state, your hypothalamus releases specific neuropeptides into your bloodstream. These molecules are information carriers. They travel through your circulatory system and bind to receptors on the surface of cells throughout your body. When a neuropeptide binds to a cellular receptor, it changes the configuration of that receptor. That configuration change sends a signal into the cell's interior, triggering a cascade of chemical reactions that ultimately reaches the nucleus where your DNA is stored. The signal tells specific genes to activate or suppress. Gene activation means your cell begins manufacturing proteins it wasn't making before. Those proteins become the structural components of your physical body. They form receptors, enzymes, antibodies, hormones, neurotransmitters. They determine how your cells communicate, how your immune system responds, how your tissues repair or degrade. This isn't occasional or minor. This is constant and comprehensive. Every sustained emotional state you experience is continuously generating molecular instructions that reshape your physical matter at the cellular level. The emotion of chronic low-level anxiety, maintained for weeks, triggers gene expression that produces elevated cortisol receptors in your hippocampus. More receptors mean more sensitivity to stress hormones. Your brain physically restructures itself to be more reactive to threat. The anxiety you feel today is building the neurobiology that will make you more anxious tomorrow. The emotion of sustained resentment activates inflammatory gene pathways. Your immune cells begin producing cytokines that create systemic inflammation. That inflammation doesn't feel like resentment. It feels like joint pain, fatigue, brain fog. You treat it as a physical problem, never recognizing it as the material form of an emotional pattern you've been maintaining. The emotion of genuine care and connection, sustained through regular experience, triggers gene expression that produces oxytocin receptors, enhances vagal tone, and promotes cellular repair mechanisms. Your body literally builds different physical structures when you maintain connection versus when you maintain isolation. This is why two people can have identical genetics, identical diets, identical exercise routines, and completely different health outcomes. The variable isn't genetic or behavioral, it's emotional. The sustained emotional patterns they run generate different molecular instructions, which build different physical realities in their bodies. But here's where the hidden quantum law becomes relevant. The mechanism I just described is classical molecular biology. Emotion triggers neuropeptide release, which triggers gene expression, which creates proteins, which become matter. That's linear causation operating through known biochemical pathways. The quantum aspect is more subtle and more powerful. It operates at the level where emotion itself originates, before it triggers the classical cascade. Quantum mechanics describes how subatomic particles exist in superposition of multiple states until measurement collapses them into definite configurations. This isn't metaphor. At the quantum level, particles literally exist as probability distributions rather than fixed positions until something interacts with them in a way that forces resolution. The revolutionary discovery that mainstream science hasn't fully integrated is that biological systems don't just operate according to classical chemistry. They harness quantum effects for information processing and decision-making at the molecular level. Your cells are quantum systems. The electrons in the molecular bonds of your DNA, the protons tunneling through enzyme active sites, the photons captured by proteins in your retina. These are quantum processes exhibiting superposition, entanglement, and coherence, even in the warm, wet environment of living tissue. Here's where it connects to emotion. The quantum state of your molecular systems is influenced by observation, not observation by eyes or instruments, observation in the quantum sense, which means any interaction that provides information about the system's state. Your conscious attention is a form of quantum observation. When you direct attention toward a particular emotional state, you're performing a measurement on the quantum superposition of possible molecular configurations in your body. That measurement influences which configurations collapse into actuality. This is the hidden law. Your emotions don't just trigger classical biochemical cascades. They function as quantum observations that influence which molecular possibilities actualize in your cells. When you sustain attention on an emotional state, you're not just generating neuropeptides, you're performing repeated quantum measurements that bias the probability distribution of molecular configurations throughout your body toward patterns that match the emotional observation. The emotion of fear, sustained through continuous attention, performs quantum observations that favor molecular configurations associated with threat response, not just through cortisol and adrenaline, through quantum influence on which proteins fold into which configurations, which receptors activate, which ion channels open. The emotion of anticipatory joy performs quantum observations that favor molecular configurations associated with reward and growth. Your attention to that emotion influences quantum processes in your cells before classical biochemistry even engages. This is why visualization and imagination have measurable physiological effects. You're not imagining that your body changes. Your sustained attention to imagined emotional states is performing quantum observations that influence actual molecular configuration in your tissues. Studies on athletes show that mental rehearsal produces measurable increases in muscle strength without physical training. The standard explanation is neural pathway development, but the quantum mechanism is deeper. Sustained attention to the emotional state of successful performance influences quantum processes in muscle cells, affecting protein synthesis and receptor configuration. Cancer patients who practice visualization show different immune profiles than those who don't. The standard explanation is stress reduction, but the quantum mechanism is more direct. Sustained attention to the emotional state of health and wholeness influences quantum processes in immune cells, affecting which genes express and which molecular configurations form. This isn't placebo effect. Placebo is the observation that belief can trigger healing without active treatment. What I'm describing is the mechanism behind placebo. Emotional states function as quantum observations that directly influence molecular configuration. But the mechanism works regardless of belief. You don't have to believe in quantum biology for your emotions to affect your molecular structure. The law operates whether you're aware of it or not. The problem is that most people are running the mechanism unconsciously, generating emotional patterns through habit rather than choice, performing quantum observations that create molecular realities they don't want. You maintain chronic worry not because circumstances require it, but because the neural pathways are grooved. That worry functions as continuous quantum observation, biasing your molecular systems toward configurations associated with threat and scarcity. Over weeks and months, your body literally becomes matter-organized around worry. You can feel this if you pay attention. Worry has a specific quality in your body, a tightness in your chest, a tension in your gut, a shallow pattern in your breathing. That's not just sensation. That's molecular configuration, the physical structure of your tissues reflecting the emotional pattern you've been sustaining. And that configuration is self-reinforcing. Once your body has built molecular structures that match worry, those structures make it easier to generate worry and harder to access other emotional states. The receptors configured for stress hormones become more sensitive. The neural pathways that activate threat response become more dominant. You've built a body that's optimized for worrying. This is the hidden mechanism behind why changing thoughts alone rarely changes experience. You try to think differently, but you're thinking from within a body that's been molecularly structured by months or years of different emotional patterns. The body pulls you back to familiar emotional states because those states match its current molecular configuration. Breaking the pattern requires working at both levels simultaneously. You need to change the emotional observations you're making, and you need to allow time for the molecular structures to reconfigure. Sustained new emotional states will eventually rebuild your physical matter to match. But there's a lag. The body you have today was built by the emotions you sustained weeks and months ago. The practical application of this law requires understanding three specific mechanisms. First, emotional sustainability. Most people try to force positive emotions through willpower or affirmations. This doesn't work because forced emotion is still generated from a body structured by previous patterns. The forcing creates internal conflict, which is itself an emotional state that generates its own molecular signature. Sustainable emotion emerges naturally when you create conditions that allow it. You can't force gratitude, but you can direct attention toward what's actually present that warrants appreciation. The genuine appreciation that arises isn't forced, it's discovered. And that authentic emotional state performs quantum observations that influence your molecular structure differently than performed gratitude. Second, pattern recognition. You need to become conscious of which emotional states you're sustaining most frequently. Most people have no accurate awareness of their emotional baseline. They think they're generally fine because they're not experiencing extreme emotions. But underneath the surface stability, there's a consistent low-level emotional tone that runs for hours every day. That tone is what's building your molecular reality, not the occasional peak of joy or spike of anger, the sustained baseline that colors your experience most of the time. To identify it, you need to check in with your actual felt sense multiple times per day. Not what you think you should be feeling. What's actually present in your body as sensation and tone. Most people discover they're running chronic, low-level versions of anxiety, frustration, resignation, or emptiness that they've normalized to the point of invisibility. That normalized emotional state is performing quantum observations constantly, shaping your molecular structure toward configurations that match the emotional pattern. If you want different physical health, different energy, different resilience, you need to shift the baseline emotional state you're sustaining. Third, time-distributed observation. Because the translation from emotion to matter happens across days and weeks, you need sustained practice rather than intense intervention. 1 hour of deep meditation generates temporary shifts in your biochemistry, but your molecular structures are built by the emotional patterns you maintain for hours every day across weeks. This is why crash diets and extreme exercise programs rarely produce lasting results. They're attempting to override molecular structures that were built by years of different emotional patterns. The body will rebuild toward its emotionally established configuration unless the underlying emotional patterns shift. The approach that actually works is subtle, consistent, and extended over time. Rather than trying to generate peak positive states, you work on shifting your baseline emotional tone slightly toward patterns that support rather than undermine your desired physical state. If your baseline includes chronic tension, you practice finding moments of genuine ease, not forcing relaxation, discovering actual ease that's available in your current experience. That authentic ease performs quantum observations that influence your molecular systems toward configurations supporting relaxation. If your baseline includes resignation, you practice noticing genuine agency, not affirming power you don't feel, recognizing actual choices you're making in each moment. That authentic recognition performs quantum observations that influence your molecular systems toward configurations supporting engagement. The shift happens slowly because molecular structures take time to rebuild. But the shift is cumulative. Each day you sustain a slightly different emotional baseline. You're biasing the quantum observations that influence which molecular configurations form in your cells. After 2 weeks of consistent practice, you'll notice the first physical changes: better sleep, more stable energy, different appetite patterns. These aren't psychological, they're molecular. Your cells have begun building different proteins based on the shifted emotional observations you've been performing. After 6 weeks, the changes become more obvious. People will comment that you seem different without being able to identify what changed. Your body is carrying different molecular structures that others perceive even if they can't articulate it. After 3 months, the shift is undeniable. Your physical body has substantially reconfigured based on the sustained emotional observations you've been making. Health markers improve, energy stabilizes, resilience increases, not because you forced anything, because you changed the quantum observations your consciousness was performing, and your molecular systems responded by building different matter. This is the hidden law. Consciousness influences matter through emotion functioning as quantum observation, not mystically. Through documented quantum biological processes that remain invisible only because the timescale of translation prevents casual observation of causation. Your body right now is the material manifestation of the emotional observations you've been sustaining for the past 3 months. Every molecule, every cell, every tissue carries the signature of emotional patterns you've been running. If you want different physical reality, you need to sustain different emotional observations, not by forcing emotion, by discovering authentic emotional states that match the physical reality you intend to build and maintaining those states consistently across the weeks and months required for molecular reconfiguration. The law is always operating. Your emotions are always turning into matter. The only question is whether you're conscious of the process and working with it intentionally or unconscious of it and building molecular realities by default. Most people are unconscious. They run emotional patterns from habit, generate molecular structures that match those patterns, then wonder why their physical health doesn't match their conscious intentions. They're trying to change matter directly through diet, exercise, and supplements, while the emotional observations that built their current molecular reality continue unchanged. This approach is backwards. Matter follows emotion because emotion functions as quantum observation that influences molecular configuration. Change the sustained emotional observations, and the matter will reconfigure to match. Maintain the same emotional patterns while trying to force physical change, and the body will rebuild toward the emotionally established configuration. The hidden quantum law reveals why consciousness work isn't separate from physical health. Your consciousness, expressed through sustained emotional states, is the primary architect of your physical matter. Not through wishful thinking or positive attitude, through quantum observations that directly influence which molecular configurations actualize in your cells. This is verifiable. You can test it through systematic practice. Choose one emotional baseline you currently maintain that you recognize as not serving your desired physical state. Replace it with a subtly different emotional tone that you can sustain authentically. Maintain that shift consistently for 6 weeks while monitoring physical markers. You'll observe changes that can't be explained by placebo or coincidence. Your molecular structure will reconfigure based on the shifted emotional observations, not dramatically, incrementally, but measurably. That direct experience of emotion translating into matter will prove the law more effectively than any theoretical explanation. You'll recognize that your body isn't a fixed physical object that occasionally responds to mental states. It's a quantum biological system continuously rebuilding itself based on the emotional observations your consciousness performs. The question isn't whether the law is real. The question is whether you'll use it consciously to build the physical reality you intend, or continue running it unconsciously, generating molecular structures by default that then constrain your experience and possibilities. The law is neutral. It operates the same whether you're aware of it or not. But conscious application allows you to participate intentionally in the continuous process of turning emotion into matter that's happening in your body every moment. Your cells are waiting for instructions. The instructions arrive as sustained emotional observations. What matter are you building today? There's a layer beneath the quantum observation mechanism that almost no one discusses. Your body doesn't just respond to emotions you're consciously experiencing. It responds to emotional information stored in your tissues from experiences you don't even remember. Developmental biologists studying epigenetics have discovered that emotional experiences create chemical marks on your DNA that don't change the genes themselves, but alter which genes can be accessed. These marks, called methylation patterns, are installed during emotionally significant moments and can persist for decades. When your mother experienced chronic stress during pregnancy, that emotional state created methylation patterns in your developing cells. Those patterns became part of your biological inheritance, predisposing certain genes to activate or suppress based on emotional states you never consciously chose. This means the body you're currently inhabiting carries molecular instructions from emotional experiences that happened before you had language, before you had explicit memory, sometimes before you were born. The emotional architecture of your matter includes information you didn't install. But here's what changes everything. Those inherited emotional patterns aren't permanent. The same mechanism that installed them can revise them. Sustained emotional states in your current experience can create new methylation patterns that override the inherited ones. This is why people sometimes experience spontaneous healing from conditions that seemed genetically predetermined. They're not overriding their genes. They're changing the epigenetic marks that determine which genetic possibilities actualize, and they're doing it through sustained shifts in emotional observation. The process requires more than casual emotional change. Inherited patterns are deeply grooved because they've been reinforcing themselves since early development. Your body has been building molecular structures based on those patterns for years or decades. Shifting them requires sustained emotional states that are strong enough to override the momentum of inherited configuration. This is where most attempts at emotional transformation fail. People work on shifting surface emotions while the deeper inherited patterns continue operating unchanged. They manage to generate temporary calm while their cells are still organized around inherited anxiety. The body keeps rebuilding toward the deeper pattern. Accessing the inherited emotional patterns requires somatic work that goes beyond mental or emotional processing. You need to engage directly with the physical sensations that carry the inherited emotional information. That chronic tension in your shoulders isn't just your reaction to current stress, it's the physical manifestation of emotional patterns that were installed in your tissue during development. The pattern has a specific quality, a particular density and location that distinguishes it from tension you're generating through current experience. When you bring sustained, non-judgmental attention to that inherited tension, something remarkable happens. The pattern begins to release not because you're forcing relaxation, but because your conscious attention is performing quantum observations on molecular structures that have been operating automatically. The release often comes with spontaneous emotional content. Feelings arise that don't seem connected to anything in your current life. Grief, rage, terror, or despair that feels disproportionate to your circumstances. This isn't psychological regression. It's molecular memory surfacing as the inherited patterns begin to dissolve. Your tissues are literally releasing emotional information that was stored before your explicit memory formed. The emotions feel overwhelming because they were overwhelming to the developing nervous system that first experienced them. But from your current adult capacity, you can allow them to complete without being overwhelmed. This is the deepest level of turning emotion into matter. You're not just building new molecular structures through current emotional states. You're dismantling inherited structures that have been constraining which emotional states you could access and which molecular configurations could form. The practical protocol requires 3 distinct phases. First, identification of inherited patterns through somatic scanning. You systematically bring attention to different areas of your body, noticing where tension feels chronic versus acute, inherited versus recent. Inherited patterns have a specific quality. They feel fundamental, like they've always been there. They don't fluctuate much with changing circumstances. They're woven into your baseline sense of being in a body. Most people carry 3 to 5 major inherited patterns, typically in the shoulders, jaw, diaphragm, lower back, or gut. Second, sustained non-judgmental presence with the pattern, not trying to release it or understand it, just bringing consistent attention to the actual physical sensation, 20 minutes daily for several weeks. This is performing quantum observations on the molecular structures carrying inherited emotional information. During this phase, spontaneous emotional releases often occur. Let them complete without analysis or story-making. The emotions arising aren't about anything in your current life. They're information discharging from tissues as the molecular structures reconfigure. Third, installation of new patterns through discovered emotion. Once inherited patterns begin releasing, space opens for different emotional baseline. But you can't force what fills that space. You discover emotional tones that become available as the old structures dissolve. These discovered emotions often surprise you. They're not what you thought you should feel or what you've been trying to generate. They're authentic emotional states that were inaccessible while inherited patterns dominated your molecular configuration. When you sustain these discovered emotions, they begin creating new molecular structures, not rebuilding the old patterns, installing genuinely new configurations that expand your emotional range and therefore your physical possibilities. The timeline for this work is longer than surface emotional shifting. Inherited patterns took years to establish their molecular dominance. Dissolving them and building new structures requires sustained practice across months. But the changes are profound in ways that surface work never achieves. People often report that their entire relationship with being in a body transforms. Chronic health conditions that seemed intractable suddenly shift. Energy patterns that were limited for decades expand. Physical capacities that seemed genetically determined change. This isn't miraculous healing. It's the natural result of changing the deepest level of emotional observation that's been building your molecular structure. When inherited patterns dissolve, the body can rebuild based on current rather than historical emotional information. There's also a collective dimension that most people never consider. The emotional patterns creating your molecular structure aren't just individual. They're embedded in cultural fields you're continuously immersed in. Your nervous system is constantly reading emotional information from your environment, not just from direct interactions, from the ambient emotional field of wherever you're located. That field carries emotional signatures from collective patterns, cultural anxiety, historical trauma, systemic oppression, collective hope or despair. Those ambient emotional fields influence your quantum observations. When you're immersed in a cultural field of chronic stress, that field biases your molecular systems toward stress-responsive configurations, even when your individual circumstances don't require it. This is why moving to a different culture or community can produce spontaneous health changes that seem unrelated to behavioral modification. You're not just changing your individual emotional patterns. You're immersing in a different collective emotional field that performs different quantum observations on your molecular systems. The practical implication is that individual emotional work has limits when you remain immersed in collective fields that contradict your individual practice. You can sustain personal calm for hours daily, but if you're immersed in collective anxiety for the remaining hours, your molecular structures receive mixed instructions. This doesn't mean you need to physically relocate. It means you need to become conscious of which collective emotional fields you're immersed in and make choices about exposure. Media consumption, social environments, work cultures, these aren't just psychological influences. They're emotional fields performing quantum observations on your cells. Limiting exposure to collective emotional fields that contradict your desired molecular configuration isn't avoidance. It's recognizing that your body is continuously reading emotional information from your environment and building matter accordingly. If you want specific molecular structures, you need consistency in the emotional observations being performed. Some people can maintain individual emotional patterns regardless of collective field. They've developed such strong internal coherence that external emotional information doesn't significantly influence their molecular configurations. But most people are more porous than they realize. Collective fields shape their baseline emotions, which shape their molecular structures, usually without conscious awareness. The hidden quantum law operates at all these levels simultaneously. Current conscious emotions performing quantum observations. Inherited patterns from early development building default configurations. Collective fields from cultural immersion biasing molecular possibilities. All continuously translating emotion into matter. Your body right now is the integration of all these levels. Current emotional observations layered over inherited patterns immersed in collective fields. The molecular structures you're carrying were built through this complex interaction. Transforming those structures requires working at all levels. Shifting current emotional baseline, dissolving inherited patterns through somatic work, consciously managing collective field exposure. This integrated approach allows molecular reconfiguration that single-level work cannot achieve. The question isn't whether emotion turns into matter. That's happening continuously whether you're aware of it or not. The question is whether you're participating consciously in the process at all levels, or allowing default patterns to build molecular structures that then constrain your possibilities. Your cells rebuild continuously. The matter of your body 3 months from now will be substantially different from the matter you're carrying today. The blueprint for that rebuilding is being written right now, through the emotional observations you're sustaining at all levels. What matter are you building? Not through what you think or believe, but through the actual sustained emotional observations your consciousness is performing moment to moment, layered over inherited patterns, immersed in collective fields. That's the question the hidden quantum law requires you to answer through direct examination of your experience.